What you're saying is that baby steps. It's going to be great.
Let's get seated. On behalf of the Mount Washington Valley Economic Council, I want to welcome all of you to the first of our two major debates this fall. First, I want to thank our business sponsor. It's Cooper, Cargill, and Chant, the 3 C's. And not only are they our sponsor today, they're our sponsor on the 30th when we will have the gubernatorial debate. So could we give a round of applause to the authors? As you know, Eggs and Issues has a tradition of sponsoring political debates. We are having it videotaped. It will be shown on all of our cable access stations so that folks who weren't able to make it today will be able to listen to our candidates, get a better sense of their policies. And as always, we want to thank George Epstein. George does a phenomenal job as our moderator, has done it on a number of occasions, and we were delighted that he was willing to join us again. And then one small family note, I want to thank John McMillan for recruiting my son Nick, who will be our timekeeper this morning. So, okay, with that, I'll turn it over to George.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. If you do this long enough, people applaud for you even before you start. And I want to thank the presidential moderators for the presidential debates for doing such a poor job that makes me look better at the front. If you don't agree with that, that's okay. First of all, I'd like to especially thank the two candidates for coming up here. It is a very nice thing for them to do. We are not the highest volume of voters in the entire state or in the entire District 1, and it's a treat for them to come up here and be willing to join with us this morning. I appreciate that very much. I thank all of you for coming. You have two responsibilities, you the audience. One is to applaud only at the end of the opening statements, each candidate's opening remarks and each candidate's closing remarks, and to be quiet otherwise. We want to hear from them, and we don't really want to hear from you other than that. We want to learn as much as we can from them. But don't hold back following the opening statements and the closing remarks. You have one other responsibility, and that is to actually listen to the questions and to expect that the candidates will actually answer the question that's being asked. And we have had candidates who didn't actually do that. These folks will not be a problem that way, but it's up to you to hold their feet to the fire and make sure they're actually answering the questions that are being asked. Our candidates have only one responsibility to us today, and that, or to me anyway, and that is to stay within the time limits that are being announced prior to each question. And our timekeeper, Nick, will be holding up 30-second, 10-second, and 0-second signs. When it gets to 0, you better stop. If you go over a second or two, fine, finish your sentence. But if you go over a bunch of seconds, I may well wind up penalizing you in the future and saying, boy, the other candidate's going to get a minute to answer this one. You're only going to get 30 seconds. And so you don't want to be punished by me. The ultimate weapon is my bell. the shame that would be incurred if you experienced that. We have two candidates here, both of whom have served us in the United States Congress, something that I personally appreciate very, very much. They worked very hard to play that role, and they've worked very hard in that role. To my left is former Congresswoman Carol Shea Porter, and she will be speaking to you this morning and presenting her positions on the issues. To my right is current Congressman Frank Guinta, and he will also be representing his interests very well, and we will be enjoying hearing from both of them. I have flipped a coin witnessed by the Conway Daily Sun, and the result of that coin flip says that Mr. Guinta, and I will not use congresswoman and congressman and titles and so on, not out of disrespect, but just to save myself some syllables during the course of the day. Mr. Guinta will be speaking first in terms of the opening statements, and he will be speaking last in the closing statement. So he actually won the coin flip. So I'm sharing that information with you. The only other question really is whether the candidates should stand when they speak to you. It is a little bit disruptive to have them jumping up and down, so I'm going to ask them to sit and be comfortable and keep the camera on them, and they are not being disrespectful to you by doing that. I know it makes it a little harder for folks in the back to see them, but I think that's probably the more efficient way to run this operation. If you feel the need at the closing statements to stand, don't hold back, go crazy, stand right up if you can. I think with that, we will get started. We're going to have 1 minute opening statements, and Mr. Guinta will speak first. Frank Guinta.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here this morning. I want to thank the Mount Washington Valley Economic Council for hosting this debate. I want to thank also my opponent for being here. I think this is an important opportunity for all of us to discuss the challenges that we face as a state and as a nation. And I think we have a very critical choice to make in how we move our economy forward, how we make an opportunity for the middle class in our country to have better opportunities, how we have responsible ways to balance our budget, to reduce our debt in long-term, short-term deficit and long-term debt, and how we ensure that the strength and vibrancy of the Granite State is properly reflected and represented in Washington, D.C. I've had the privilege of representing you for this term, and it has been my honor and been my privilege. And I'm proud not only to focus on substantive economic policy in Washington, but when I'm home with my family and our constituents, focusing on things like getting Granite Staters back to work and continuing to listen to your needs. And I thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Ms. Shea Porter.
And I too thank everybody for attending and for having this, and I'd like to say that I do wish that Congressman Guinta would also go to the Seacoast and do the same thing that we're doing here, because it is important. So I'm going to invite him again to go to the Seacoast and have a debate there as well. And this is a very important election. There's a very critical difference between the two Congresses I served in, the 110th and the 111th, and Mr. Guinta's Congress, the 112th. The difference could be summed up simply by the way two congressional observers, one from a conservative think tank and one from a moderate think tank, called these two Congresses. One was called the most productive since Roosevelt, and the other one, they actually wrote a book called It's Worse Than It Looks, and said that they are so ideologically locked in cement that they have been unable to function. And when you see a Congress, 20% of the scant bills passed is simply naming post offices, there's a big difference. So I look forward to this debate, and I thank Mr. Guinta for being up here, and I thank all of you again.
I think we all owe the candidates a debt of gratitude for all by themselves keeping the United States Postal Service in business. You two are perhaps the most horrible human beings on the face of the earth, if I were reading these things. And in particular, you seem to have a goal of killing off as many of our elderly citizens as possible, based on my reading of these, both of you. And I think that's where we should start, since that seems to be an important focus of a lot of the communications we've gotten, some of which come from the campaigns and some of which do not come from the campaigns directly. Let me start with Mr. Guinta. Mr. Guinta, you have a plan, or you support the plan that provides fixed payments to seniors for their insurance coverage, for their medical coverage, and that will enable seniors to buy their own insurance with a fixed amount of money. What happens when that money doesn't permit seniors to actually purchase the insurance they need to get the kind of coverage they get today?
Well, here's the challenge that I think America faces relative to Medicare. Last May, the trustees of Medicare issued a report to the Budget Committee in Congress that simply stated if nothing is done in the next 12 years, Medicare will go bankrupt. That is something that I don't want to see, and I don't think anyone in Congress wants to see. So I think we did the responsible thing and put a proposal together in the House of Representatives, both last year and this year. And this year we were able to gain the support of a Democrat, Senator Wyden from Oregon, who joined Republicans in trying to find a bipartisan solution. And here it is very quickly. If you are 55 and older, you are exempt from any proposals or any changes. You have traditional Medicare as it currently exists. If you're under that age, you have the choice between traditional Medicare or what we refer to as premium support, where you get a book in the mail similar to a member of Congress. You select the coverage that you want, and a check is sent to that carrier on your behalf.
Would you take an extra minute to finish, please?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kind of tough to do in 1 minute.
I apologize. I meant to say 2 minutes.
So a check is sent to the carrier on your behalf. Why this is important is in terms of preserving and protecting Medicare. We want to make sure that there are enough funds, not just for the next 12 years, but for the next 100 years. And providing this option, providing more opportunity for choice, allows not just current seniors, but future seniors to have the very, very best care and quality of care that they deserve. I believe that in the next Congress, because there is a willingness now on a bipartisan basis to fix Medicare, including what the President of the United States has talked about most recently, there is a real opportunity to do this. But the reality is that we're putting solutions on the table based on facts. I don't want to see any more scare tactics in this country, because programs like Medicare are important not just to existing seniors, but to future retirees.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ms. Shea Porter, you'll have 2 minutes to comment on your plans for Medicare. Your website says, quote, "Leave it alone, House Republicans." Can we afford to leave it alone, and is the program going to fail if we don't act to take steps to adjust the program?
Well, happily, last night, as a matter of fact, was reading that Medicare trustee report. And what it actually says that by 2024, it will be 90% capable of paying the hospital insurance. Not going bankrupt, but 90% capable. So there'll be a shortfall in the HI part. But the other parts, Medicare Part B and Medicare Part D, will be able to continue indefinitely without a change. I like the way Republicans say that will give Medicare recipients more choice. My mother used Medicare very heavily the last year of her life. She had every choice available, more choices than most people have if they have an HMO. So that's not a true thing. That's a red herring. Kaiser report just came out 2 days ago. They said it's been the lowest insurance premium increase, 4%, under 4% for all of insurance. So something's working that we're doing. Let's make a few more points about this Medicare. They like to call it a voucher or premium support. You say tomato, I say tomato. You say Santa, I say St. Nick. But let's say this. Let's say that Maine Senator Olympia Snowe was accurate when she voted against it, and the reason that she gave was, and I quote, essentially privatizes Medicare. So what we will have here is a Medicare voucher, which Mr. Guinta said is what Congress has, but it's not. It's not at all. Because a Medicare voucher is tied to the GDP plus half a point, which sits at about 1.72%. So every single year, seniors will lose because our premiums are actually tied to the increase in healthcare costs. Medicare would be tied to GDP plus half a point. That's a very important difference there. And finally, what about people under 55? What happens to them? And they didn't answer that question.
Thank you. And you're doing a terrific job on time. Thank you both very much. We're going to come back to healthcare in some additional detail, but I'm going to talk about the other big issue that people are referring to constantly, which is the creation of jobs. Ms. Shea Porter, what are the specific things the federal government can do to create jobs?
Well, first let me say that we, the 110th, 111th Congress, kept this country from falling into depression. In October of 2008, after the Wall Street fiasco, the month before the president came in, we were hemorrhaging jobs, 800,000 in 1 month. So by passing the stimulus and other action we took, we saved the country from falling into depression. So now, here we are, we have a 7.8% unemployment rate, and we've had 31 months of continuous job growth. But it's still sluggish, and there are still people who are not working and are looking for jobs. So we have to go ahead and put a comprehensive jobs bill in. This Congress has not passed a comprehensive jobs bill. The congressman will tell you we did, but they didn't. They passed one thing that says that more investors can come into small business before they have to file with the FEC. That's not a comprehensive jobs bill. So the reality is that we have to do that. We have to bring business home. We can offer tax credits for companies, manufacturers that bring jobs back here. We should double the expense cuts for deductions for businesses that's starting up. Many things we can do.
Thank you. Go right to Mr. Guinta. What are the specific things the federal government should do to create jobs, or can do to create jobs? 1 minute.
Well, there's a number of things the House of Representatives has done. Number one, we have passed back in May, signed into law by the President, a jobs bill focused on job creators, not what my opponent wants, which is a second stimulus. Very, very different. Secondly, we have also passed more than 30 different jobs-related bills targeted to different industry, to help different industry and small business spur on the economy. Many of these pieces of legislation were passed bipartisanly, and almost all of them await action in the Senate. If you go to guinta.house.gov and hit the jobs tracker button, you'll see every single bill and the status of every single bill. But beyond that, here's what we need to do. I don't subscribe to the notion of an $810 billion borrowed taxpayer stimulus. It didn't work in the last 4 years, and let me explain why. 43 consecutive months of unemployment over 8%. The unemployment rate now is 7.8%. Why? Because the labor participation rate is at the lowest in 30 years. Our GDP, according to the Department of Labor for Q2, is now at 1.3%. That's not going to help small business here in the Valley, and it's not going to help small business around the country.
Thank you. Let's drill down just a little bit further into that with regard, Mr. Guinta, to the stimulus spending that did occur. In 1929, 33, 132, we had 25% unemployment. We had half the banks in America fail. Wasn't it a really smart move in the next minute that you're going to explain to me for us to pass that stimulus bill and keep unemployment down towards the 10% range, to have only 1.5% or 2% of our banks fail in this country? Wouldn't we have been gambling with the great collapses that occurred during the 30s if we'd not passed the stimulus bill?
Well, the 30s in this economy are very, very different, number one. Number two, the President of the United States and my opponent supported this, said if we pass the stimulus at $800 billion, we will see a return of unemployment under 6%. We haven't seen that, period. And for 43 consecutive months, we had unemployment in this country over 8%. Try talking to somebody in the middle class who's been looking for a job for more than 6 months, who is struggling to pay their bills, and ask them if that stimulus helped them. Ask our small business owners right here in the Conway area if the stimulus bill has provided more predictability for them, or if it has been more challenging for them. Ask our small business owners and job creators if the bureaucracy, the federal regulatory requirements are helping their businesses, or if they're inhibiting their businesses from long-term growth and job creation. And I think the answers are very clear. We want to help companies like Coleman, we want to help companies like T Enterprises, who are great family-run small businesses right here in the region, to grow and to be able to have greater opportunities for higher salaries, higher wages, and you only do that by having a strong economy.
Let's help the Echo Group too. Just
We'll help you
off the record, yeah, just between the two of us.
Brought to you by George Epstein for
what? For CEO. Ms. Guinta, 4 years the president's been a At least I got the Ms. right.
I have to say, I don't think either one of us up here would want that to happen.
No.
my wife
So do
would
I
take
get to
issue with
answer?
it.
My whole transgender question's been messed up. That's why our debates take 90 minutes rather than 60 minutes here. We tend to get distracted by how I garble the questions. Ms. Shea Porter, the president's been in office for 4 years. The number of people employed in the United States are actually about 2 million fewer than were employed when he took office. And the rates go up and down. The actual number of jobs that are in America has declined during that period of time. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars, arguably well over $1 trillion, to sort of pump money into the economy. If you count the deficits, we've spent $5 trillion to try and pump up the economy. Hasn't this been a failure? And really, what can the government do to improve the job situation in America?
Okay, do I get a
full
30-second rebuttal for what Mr. Guinta says?
No, I get to grant those.
Okay.
Thanks for asking.
I was politely waiting to ask.
Absolutely.
I really wanted to address that, but okay. Well, first of all, we have to remember again that when we looked at the Bush era, it was the fewest jobs created. So it's not like this problem just started when President Obama came in. And you cannot overstate the mess that we were in. I was there. I know what it looked like. I know we were right on the brink of a depression there. And so when you look at what they've accomplished for 4 years, as President Clinton said, no president, not him, not anybody, could take us out of the mess that we were left. The mess that we got into, as we all know, came because we had 2 wars that were not paid for, and we had tax cuts for very wealthy. We cut revenue coming in 30%. This was a great shock to our economy. And it's not the over-regulation. They've been surveyed, and businesses say what it is lack of consumer demand. We are a consumer-driven economy, and austerity measures, such as my opponent endorses, would not put money in middle-class pockets. It just would not. What we need is jobs coming with the help of all levels of government and helping small business to launch. I'm out of time, or I'd keep talking.
I know you both would, actually. Would you take another minute, though, to talk a little bit further about regulation, Ms. Shea Porter? 70 years ago, the Glass-Steagall bill was passed that separated investment banks that gamble, that speculate, from our commercial banks, and it was repealed a few years ago, and very quickly following that repeal, we had this horrible crash. It was responded to by a Democratic Congress with the Dodd-Frank bill, which was enormously, and is enormously convoluted. There are still thousands of pages of regulations that the bureaucrats need to write in support of that. Isn't that exactly the wrong kind of solution? Big, complex regulatory bill like Dodd-Frank, rather than just going back to Glass-Steagall?
Well, I like Glass-Steagall, and I have to say that Congressman Dingell warned everybody when they ended that we would see exactly what we saw. And so, and then talk about regulation, which we're talking about. The fact is, they didn't regulate Wall Street. Everybody knows that they didn't regulate Wall Street. One of the former directors said, you know, when the party gets too wild, it's time to take away the punch bowl. And they didn't do that, and it was the lack, as a matter of fact, they were told, the Bush administration was told by the FBI that they needed more investigators, they needed more regulation, and they would not do that. So now what we're seeing, yes, the bill is very complex, no question about it. But if you look at our whole tax bill and the whole tax legislation, very complex. And if anybody sitting here thinks it's because all members of Congress are brilliant CPAs and they're writing that code themselves, I would say you might want to take a look to see who's giving money to whom. This is the effect that we're seeing of special interests, creating this kind of labyrinth that is very difficult, extremely difficult. They literally insert the legislation in, and it's outrageous.
Thank you. Mr. Guinta, the same question, but flipping it over a little bit, wasn't the collapse in 2008 very much a function of a financial industry gone wild, creating these very Byzantine derivatives, trading on these mortgage derivatives, having rating agencies rate bad investments AAA, and having a mix of commercial banks and investment banks now combined, growing to be too large to fail, and us getting into a situation where if we didn't bail them out, as we didn't bail out Lehman Brothers, we have a horrible situation. Don't we need more regulation in the, particularly the financial industry, in order to protect us from what they are doing to us and have done to us?
George, there's no question that there were some bad actors, and those bad actors should be held accountable for their actions. However, Dodd-Frank, the attempt of Dodd-Frank was to suggest that there was no regulatory authority to address these issues. That's false. There were regulatory mistakes that were made. There was incompetence in certain regulatory agencies, including the SEC, that were asleep at the wheel. That is wrong. And American people in our country are left holding the bag as a result of it. So what I think we do need is appropriate regulatory oversight. But you also need clear, definitive rules. Dodd-Frank has 400 rules that still have to be written into law. How can you, if you are trying to manage someone's money, not know what those rules are and still be a good advocate for the individual or the small business that you're managing? That's part of the fundamental problem. Is it's not that we have a regulatory issue, it's that we don't have enough of the proper regulatory oversight. And that's what I think Dodd-Frank attempted to deal with, but instead it has a whole host of new regulations, 400 new regulations that still haven't been written. That's giving uncertainty.
You went over a bit. I'm going to give you 30 seconds follow-up on that, and then I'll be giving Ms. Shea Porter a full minute to follow up. And I'd like you particularly to address two questions. One is, do you then support the return of Glass-Steagall, Steagall number one? And number two, when you look at the kind of disastrous approach or results that came from the pharmaceutical industry's compounding organization that created this meningitis problem across America, and those are very unregulated operations. Doesn't America actually need more regulation in order to protect us from bad actors, as you pointed out? 30 seconds, Glass-Steagall and compounding and pharmaceutical industry.
Well, but only 30 seconds.
Yourself in that
So here's what I would say. If your question is, do we need more regulation? I don't think you need more. What I think you need is the existing regulatory agencies actually do their job properly. I mean, we know what the basic rules are, what the basic laws are. They need to be utilized in such a way where the bad actors are identified. That didn't happen, particularly at the SEC. I would take a look at Glass-Steagall. I think in the next Congress, we're going to have a whole host of different approaches. But the most, well, okay.
Thank you. 1 minute, Ms. Shea Porter, again, aren't we over-regulated? We hear constant complaints from businesses about the barrage of regulations, EPA regulations, as well as the length of time it takes to bring valuable drugs to market, and the issues associated with financial regulation. Don't we have too much regulation?
I think in some areas there is too much regulation, and we have to be reasonable and look at this. But what's interesting to me is hearing my opponent talk about deregulation, regulation, and trying to take two sides of it. The reality is that he's a Tea Partier, and he went to Washington saying that he was going to deregulate, and I can list the things that he wanted to not just deregulate, but abolish. And for example, he wanted to abolish the EPA, he wanted to abolish the Department of Education, he wanted to abolish the IRS, he wanted to abolish, well, the UN. I mean, there's a long list. So I think, but when we talk about it, we have to talk about, yeah, are there places where regulation is heavy? Sure. And are there times that I can give you an example there, where the regulations for brownies, to sell brownies to the Pentagon, it's insane. Who would actually sit and write page after page after page about that? So there's no doubt, and I think all of us know that there's lots of places to go there. But the basic idea that one of the roles of government is to protect us from bad actors still stands, and we need to do that better.
Thank you. Let's take 2 full minutes, Ms. Shea Porter, to balance the budget. The Democratic Party doesn't seem to really have a plan. It's not a 3-year plan or a 10-year plan or a 30-year plan or a 40-year plan. There's no plan that says this is how we're going to balance the budget. The only thing that we really know folks are interested in is allowing the Bush tax cuts for those over $250,000 to lapse and to essentially increase taxes on the highest paid individuals. Do you think we should have a plan to balance the budget? Should there be a long-range plan so that we know we're going to get there, or are we just going to keep spending in a deficit mode forevermore and hope that China keeps lending us the money?
Well, let's say, first of all, that the different approach is that the Democrats understand that you cannot have a big shock to the economy, that you have to do this gradually while you keep money circulating, you keep the middle class working. Because the reality is that if you don't have money in your pocket, you are not going downtown to your stores in North Conway and Conway area and buying anything. And if you don't buy anything, those stores cannot hire people. And if they don't hire people, then people don't have jobs. So shrinking this down like that does not work, this sudden jolt, which was my opponent's plan. But let's look at that Ryan budget. They claimed that they were going to balance the budget, but economists have looked at it and said it doesn't. It doesn't balance the budget. What it does do is it will put more taxes on the middle class, and it will give tax breaks to the very wealthy. But you don't just have to take my word for it. I think Warren Buffett, who's a new American hero and the 3rd wealthiest man in the world, will happily sit there and tell you, and you can go Google his name, and he'll tell you everything that's wrong with that. So we have to do this slowly. Now, how do we do this? How do we get more revenue in? We are so low on revenue, in part because my opponent and others signed a pledge to Grover Norquist. And the pledge is that they will never, ever bring a nickel of revenue in. And should any revenue come in, they will immediately figure out how to get rid of it. They are leaving this country running in place. That will not balance the budget. The way we do this gradually is we look at all of these programs that certainly can be cut. You know, you can talk about Defense Department, you can talk about the farm, you can talk about others. There are places where we can cut. So you try to save money, and you have to. But you also need revenue. And that's an important side of this coin. And the revenue comes, 2/3 of U.S. corporations paid 0 federal income taxes. Look it up, CNN Money. 2/3. There's money there, there's money for bringing companies back, there's money by doing the Buffett rule, just saying if you are at a certain income, you need to pay a little bit more.
Thank you. Mr. Guinta, in 2 minutes, if you could comment on this, and you're, I believe, a supporter in general of the Ryan budget. Congressman Ryan says that will balance the budget in about 29 years. More pessimistic observers say it'll take 40 years, if at all. Is that satisfactory? And if not, what are the specific additional cuts or additional revenue sources that will balance the budget more quickly than that? Is that acceptable to you?
So here's where we are. We've got a $1.1 trillion deficit, and we've got a $16 trillion debt. Our GDP growth is 1.3% as of Q2, according to the Department of Labor. We've got 23 million people underemployed or out of work. Our unemployment rate is 7.8. When you look at the reduction of the labor participation rate, it's closer to 15 or 20%. That is not a good recipe for the country. That is what's been prescribed by this president and my opponent when she was in office for 4 years. Here's what we need to do. In terms of balancing the budget, we need to get back to 20% of GDP for expenditures and 20% of GDP for growth of revenue. So how do you do that? Right now, we're at 24% of expenditures on of GDP. You got to bring that down by 4%. You can do that over time within 5 years. On the revenue side, you don't have to raise taxes on people. You get people back to work. You reduce the regulatory burden on small business owners. You have a pro-growth economic policy of predictability on the rates, both on the individual and the corporate side. And let's not forget the engine of our economy are small business owners. 80% of small business owners drive our economy in New Hampshire. The last thing we want to do is raise taxes on those individuals. Bill Clinton has stated that in the last 3 months. President Obama stated that in 2009. We've got to make sure that we are protecting those individuals, not trying to take more from them for government programs that are going to grow the size of government. I think there are two very clear differences, George, in how we would approach that issue. And let me tell you, if you want to apply it to someone locally here, talk about Coleman and Son. 260 employees, 4 different regulatory agencies, OSHA, MSHA, EPA, and DES have visited that location in the last 6 months, giving 4 specific different solutions for a potential problem that they've all identified. How is that money, how is that going to benefit the 260 people who work there on a day-to-day basis? These are the things that we've got to focus on.
Let's focus on taxes for a minute, and let's take a couple of minutes to talk about taxes, Mr. Guinta. The Republican presidential candidates, vice presidential candidate, talk about reducing the tax rates by eliminating loopholes. That's the way they continue to raise revenues by reducing tax rates. But the loopholes that actually save any money are things like the mortgage interest deduction, eliminating that. That's where the money is. It's the popular ones. It's medical insurance coverage. The fact that we don't pay taxes on our employer's contribution to our medical insurance. It's IRAs and other retirement plans. It's accelerated depreciation for small businesses. It's the deduction you get for your state and local taxes you pay. If you want to actually reduce significant amounts of loopholes, those are the kinds of things you have to go after. It's the popular ones that save money. Is that really realistic, and are we really going to be able to reduce or even keep down the tax rates in order to get up to the 20% of GDP you talked about?
Yeah, I think if you have a pro-growth economic model or policy that is put in place, we can grow revenue in this country without raising tax rates. Look, what I heard from my opponent is not much of a plan other than just raise taxes. Well, you're looking at people in this room who make the economy go. And I guess I would ask my opponent, which specific people in this room are we going to raise taxes on? And then number 2, what are you going to do with that money? Are you going to pay down the deficit? Or are you going to create larger programs and grow the size of the federal government? That's what happened with the stimulus. And we had 43 consecutive months of unemployment at 8% or higher. Small business owners, entrepreneurs, job creators in our state are struggling. I visited 10 in the last week. They are struggling. Raising taxes is not going to be the solution. The President of the United States, on one hand, says we shouldn't raise taxes in a recession. Then he says, on the other hand, if we raise the top 2 rates, that will bring in, according to his own budget officer, $70 billion. So I would ask my opponent, let's say those taxes are raised, and it brings in, according to the President's budget officer, $70 billion. What's the next step? You haven't reduced the deficit under $1 trillion. You haven't been able to spur the economy on. We still have a long-term debt of $16 trillion. So what is the solution beyond raising the rates on the top 2 rates, which are our small business owners here in the state? And I have not heard that answer from my opponent.
Well, let's get it.
Okay.
Ms. Shea Porter,
I'm ready.
I'll just frame it one more time. The discussion earlier on balancing the budget, there was a focus on increasing rates and increasing the amount of revenue coming in. Is that the sole solution, and how are you going to go about doing that without creating lots of problems for businesses and for individuals who are salaried?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm so happy the Republicans have discovered the middle class. Unfortunately, it's just been in the last few weeks. So we are not raising taxes on the middle class. Mitt Romney said that we did not raise taxes, and then of course he warned that we would in the second administration, but he admitted we didn't raise taxes. Okay, 97% of businesses and individuals are unaffected. As a matter of fact, they got tax cuts, 8 tax cuts for small businesses when I was in Congress, and tax cuts in the stimulus and everywhere else for individuals. It's 97%, I think it's 97.5. So that's not true either. This is the lowest tax rate since the 50s, and if you look at the wealth charts there, you can see what's happened where the middle class has been sliding downwards and the top 1% have been shooting upwards. And why he is not concerned about that, I don't know. He actually said in North Conway that if we were going to take away oil subsidies from the top 5, to be fair, we should give them the land leases for free. He doesn't want to tax anybody except the middle class.
George, can I respond to that, please?
Why don't we go a minute, each of you, but I'd like you to include in your response the whole signing of pledges and the agreement, the decision you made, I believe, to sign the Grover Norquist pledge not to raise any taxes at all. If you could just comment on that as part of your additional minute.
My pledge is to the people of New Hampshire that I represent. And what I pledge to do is to be effective and efficient with your taxpayer dollars. I'm a steward of your taxpayer dollars. That's the way I ran Manchester when I was mayor, and that's what I do as your representative in Congress. I want to go back to the middle class. I want people in this room to understand, neither one of my parents went to college. I'm the first one in my family to actually go to college. I spent times working on a sheep farm. I spent a year working at Home Depot. Why? Because actually it was my 3rd job, so I could save money to buy my wife her engagement ring. I have a pretty good understanding of what it's like to work hard, to try to provide for your family, and to make sure that everyone in this country has an opportunity for success. An American dream is for the next generation to be better than the previous generation. And I saw my folks work in their small business for 40 years to provide that opportunity for me and my 2 siblings. And that's what Morgan and I are trying to do for our children. And that's what we want to do for America. This class warfare argument is getting old. Let's talk about facts and solutions for a better country, for a better tax system, for a fairer system, so everyone in America has an opportunity to succeed.
Thank you. And Ms. Shea Porter, another minute on in general taxes, and apparently philosophy as well. You commented earlier on what a mess our tax code is and the role of lobbyists in the drafting of the tax code. You've been in the Congress. How do we fix this? The tax code, there's no one in this room that would say this is a really great idea, our tax code. What should it look like?
Well, the first thing you need to do is say, I don't take any corporate PAC money or DC lobbyist money. That's the first thing. My opponent does. My opponent has money from oil companies. He has money from these interests. This is not a good thing. So campaign finance reform is where it begins. It gets a lot purer and a lot simpler when we're not getting money from those sources. The pro-growth economic model phrase that my opponent keeps using, can anybody tell me what that means? They just keep saying these words there. But the reality is, the kind of cut they're talking about would provide such a shock, 30 to 40% cuts to our system. It would include everything that we need, infrastructure, Medicare, all the programs we rely on would go. Senator Coburn, a very conservative Republican from Oklahoma, wrote a booklet, and it's called Subsidies of the Rich and Famous. And you can imagine what's in that. And he said many of us work 2 jobs to make up for those subsidies of the rich and famous there. And my opponent has been supporting those subsidies. He was in the Ryan budget. He sat on the budget committee and voted for it.
Thank you.
George, just so you know, there were no subsidies in the Ryan budget.
I'm going to limit our time. I am going to limit our time to the assigned times. We will continue to go down that road. But the tension is building a little bit, so I'm going to ask Ms. Shea Porter her preference. Casablanca or the Wizard of Oz?
Casablanca.
Casablanca?
Yeah.
Casablanca or the Wizard of Oz?
Wizard of Oz.
He still has little kids.
I was trying to bring them together. I was unsuccessful. Let's bounce around a little bit, though, and let's go back to health care for just a minute. The Affordable Care Act, and I hope we can all agree to call it Obamacare so everyone knows what we're talking about. Ms. Shea Porter is 2,700 pages long, depending on the font you use. And so far, there are more than 4,000 pages of regulations that supplement the 2,700 pages that are in the law. Isn't this thing just a retirement plan for lawyers and consultants? Isn't the burden on businesses associated with that kind of wildly complex regulation completely unreasonable, regardless of the functions and the intent of the law? Isn't this a bad law? You have 1 minute to tell me why it is. What is it?
No, if anybody's ever had an insurance policy and discovered that they were being left out, you would find it in tiny print on page 865, that if you've ever had a toenail break, you will now not get coverage for breast cancer. This is a result of lawyers and insurance companies. These are not individuals who say, wouldn't it be great to have a 900-page rule there? This is what we inherited. This has been the system. I mean, I think it needs to be narrowed down, but it's because you have to keep explaining and protecting and thinking about all the angles here. Luckily, people don't have to read that, although I did. I was on the committee, one of the committee's jurisdiction working on that. But people can go to healthcare.gov. You can go there for small business right now and see how this healthcare bill will help you, and it will explain to you. There's so many rumors there, so I recommend healthcare.gov for everybody to see how it impacts them. So yes, it is difficult, but I promise you, if you look at any contract anywhere, you can see that we have lots and lots of lawyers and insurance people and other people who are engaged in this. So that's the reason, to make sure we cover it properly.
Thank you. Mr. Guinta, assuming you're not a big fan of the Obamacare bill, which of the components of that bill, the actual functional results of that bill, whether it's 26-year-olds being able to stay on their parents' coverage, the ability for people to get insurance who have pre-existing conditions, reducing payments to medical equipment manufacturers and insurance companies, requiring emergency rooms to serve people, even those who can't pay. Which of those would you eliminate from the bill, and would you be comfortable repealing the bill if you lost those?
What I think we need to do is look at healthcare in a completely different way. The Affordable Care Act is a mandate from the federal government dictating and mandating certain types of coverage and mandating purchases. That is not what I think is the best way to improve the healthcare system in the country. What I would take is a very, very different approach. Number one, here in New Hampshire, you don't have any more than 2 carriers writing coverage in the state. That we are all at a disadvantage because of that. So let's bring more carriers in. Or, as I've talked to the insurance commissioner of the state of New Hampshire, let's have cooperative agreements with contiguous or regional areas so we have more buying power. Secondly, transparency is a significant problem. Nobody here can, when they go to get some sort of medical treatment, can tell me or yourself how much it's actually costing. That's a problem. So one of the things that I did when I was in my last year as mayor, went to the 17 unions in the city and said, not through legislation, but through a volunteer approach. If I can do an extra minute.
Why don't you take another full minute, but if you'd also make sure as part of that you answer the question about, I'll let you finish.
Yeah, go ahead. So here's what we did. We said to the 17 unions for the city employees, if we allow you to know the prices, we got the prices from the carriers, from the hospitals, we gave them to the individuals and their families. If you choose the most expensive, that's okay. If you choose the least expensive, you and the city get a piece of that savings. The city taxpayers save $40,000 in week 1. Employees were getting checks because they had transparency. They had more choice. That is going to be a fundamental approach in how we change healthcare. The state of New Hampshire is now doing a pilot program because it worked in Manchester. They're saving, with state employees, $100,000 a month. In terms of pre-existing, in terms of age 26, those are things that we can work out to make sure that nobody is denied coverage because of a pre-existing or because they're under 26 years old.
Okay, thank you. In 2 minutes, Ms. Shea Porter, no, I'm sorry. You've already had your opportunity to speak to that. I'm going to mess this whole thing up, but I am going to go to Ms. Shea Porter. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is very much focused on who pays for medical care, moving it to individual mandate, adding responsibilities to businesses and so on in terms of their coverage. It doesn't get very much at the cost of health care. The real issue for America is that health care in America costs 50% to 100% more than any other country in the world. And we don't really get better results. What are we going to do about managing the cost of health care? Because it doesn't seem like we're doing anything about that.
Well, actually, there were a lot of steps taken in that health care bill to manage it, but I just want to say that this is not a mandate as such. Nobody has to have health insurance. There will be a penalty, but nobody has to have health insurance, and that's an important difference here. And the penalty, before everybody goes and laughs about this, it was Mitt Romney's idea. And you know what? It came from a conservative group, and it was a good idea. And what they said was they didn't want, for conservative principles, they didn't want free riders. So they didn't want people showing up at the emergency room, which brings me to the point you're talking about, that people were going to the emergency room, and you and I were paying for that. So there is not that mandate as such, right? But the reality is that we have to control costs. So the big ways that they're controlling costs in this health care plan is preventive health care. Medicare, for example, seniors will now have access to preventive health care. So will others. Being female will not be a pre-existing condition, which is a great thing. We also know that if we treat early, it's better. We've controlled insurance company costs. Can I have the 30 seconds also?
You take another full minute, and we'll go back to Mr. Guinta for 2 minutes as well.
Okay, one of the ways that we controlled costs was we said to insurance companies, you cannot have more than 20% overhead costs anymore. They were having 47% overhead and passing it on to the consumer. That's a big difference. If they raise their premiums more than 10% now, they have to publicly say why. And if they can't justify that they get refunds, people are already getting refunds. Those are big ways to control costs. But we also need to work with hospitals and others and determine, and we're working on this, and there's legislation inside that bill. What are the returns when we send a taxpayer dollar to a hospital? Do they repeat admissions? You know, are they performing properly? So there are lots of ways that will hold down the cost, but you're absolutely right. And that's why I'm so excited about taking care of children with pre-existing conditions, taking care of kids under the age of 26, enrolling people, educating them. There's a nutrition part. So all of this, we know diabetes is absolutely rampant. We need education, we need prevention, and we need early treatment. And this bill, this now law, does that.
Thank you. Mr. Guinta, you spoke convincingly about how transparency has helped to manage costs. But in the end, if you're going to take many, many billions of dollars out of healthcare costs, won't doctors, won't medical equipment manufacturers, won't hospitals, won't pharmaceutical companies all make less money? And in the end, how else can we reduce costs unless those folks wind up with less money?
Well, let's remind everybody the Affordable Care Act, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which was just rescored as a piece of legislation after this, the United States Supreme Court case, at $1.8 trillion. We're talking about your money, actually we're talking about borrowed money right now, because we are running deficits and we have long-term debt at $16 trillion. This is a $1.8 trillion solution that was passed by the President and my opponent. The Kaiser Foundation that she referenced earlier actually issued a report that said the President wanted to reduce the average family premium by $2,500. It's actually gone up $2,300. It's gone in the wrong direction. Affordability has not happened. If you ask small business owners who really have one or two options here in the state for coverage, ask them what their premiums are going up by, it is still anywhere from 15 to 22%. So far, this has not been working. And finally, let me add, she said this is not a mandate. This is a mandate. The United States Supreme Court issued its opinion and said if you don't purchase health insurance, in year one, you will pay a tax. Guess how much it is in year one? up to $695 per person, collected by the IRS. This legislation, I understand the intention of it. The intention here, and the President, I think, has a good intention in trying to reduce cost and create greater accessibility. I think we all agree with that in those goals. I don't believe this bill addresses those goals. Now, you talked about taking money out of the system. The CBO also scored the Medicare component. And the number that you keep hearing is $716 billion. Let me tell you where that number comes from. The CBO again scored after this Supreme Court decision that this bill takes $716 billion out of Medicare to fund the Affordable Care Act. But what it does is reduce payments to hospitals and physicians who have said they are no longer going to treat Medicare patients. That is not a solution for seniors 65 and older, and is not a solution to improve access and reduce cost for health care across the board.
Thank you. Boy, we could stay on health care. Let's stay one more minute on health care, Mr. Guinta. I'm 25 years old.
You look good.
I look awful for 25 years old, but thank you. I'm 25 years old. There's no mandate for me to purchase insurance. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital, by law, must treat me when I walk in the door. Whether I have any money, whether I have any intent to pay or not, I have to be treated. Isn't it a good Republican principle to say everybody ought to pay for their own medical insurance? And if we're going to require hospitals to treat them, shouldn't they be required, if they have the capacity to pay, and there's a sliding fee and there are federal subsidies, but shouldn't you be required what you're able to pay to your medical care? Well, 1 minute.
Yes, people should be responsible for their own actions. People should be
I'm going to
paying.
stop you for 1 second. There's a little switch right behind you. Isn't there a black little switch there? There it is, just the tiniest bit down, because I think aren't we getting reverberation? Okay, it's driving me crazy, so it should be driving everyone crazy. Let's go with that, but you should have to speak, and we all probably have to speak up a little bit as a result.
Look, if you go purchase a good or service, you're supposed to pay for it. So, yes, if you are 25 years old and you are choosing not to purchase insurance with the expectation of trying to get it free from the ER at Memorial, that shouldn't be the case. But for those people who are in a situation that truly can't afford health insurance, those are the people that we really want to focus on and try to figure out how to provide them care. So community health centers, the expansion of community health centers should be part of the long-term, the short-term and the long-term goal in terms of providing access to low or middle-income families and individuals.
Thank you. And Ms. Shea Porter, if you could follow up on,
Yes.
goodness, I think we probably have to kill it, and we're just going to have to be, you have a better solution? You think it's me? Everyone agreed it was my fault? We're in complete agreement on that? It's a bipartisan agreement?
So do you want me to just talk a minute?
If you could hang on 1
Sure.
second. I will speak loudly and you will be able to hear me, will you not?
Yes.
If you could take a minute to speak, but I would like you to speak to this issue of community health centers. People seem enthusiastic bipartisanly enthusiastic about community health centers, but don't they simply create a two-track healthcare system? One is a place for poor people to go. Why don't we simply fund Medicaid adequately so that the fees that people who are on Medicaid will permit them to go to the same doctors that everybody else goes to?
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, first of all, I wanted to say to small business owners out there that if you have under 50 employees, you don't even have to worry about whether you have health insurance, and the IRS won't actually give you a bill. It would come from a refund. Now, I like the idea that my opponent likes community health centers, and I'm really sorry that he voted against them. In the Ryan Budget Act, he voted against them. And in the Affordable Care Act, the community health centers do become a centerpiece. There's a lot more money going in. And by the way, the stimulus brought a lot of money to community health centers as well. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have the Avis Goodwin Center and others that are taking care of people. But they provide very, very good quality service, and I support a community health center concept. There's bipartisan emotional support, but there's not bipartisan financial support here. The difference is that my opponent and the Republicans in Congress voted to end the funding and voted against them in the Affordable Care Act. And I think that's a mistake.
Thank you. Beatles or the Rolling Stones?
Depends. Right?
Little wishy-washy, but okay.
Oh, tell me you don't like both of them.
I do. You're right. Beatles or the Rolling Stones?
The Rolling Stones.
Rolling Stones, okay. Well, decisive. A little rough around the edges.
I knew there was a trap in that question.
No, I wasn't going to comment, but I did anyway. For most of my life, we had a foreign policy that would fit on a bumper sticker. America's foreign policy was contain communism. It was really simple. We disagreed frequently about how best to do that, but that was our foreign policy. In 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on, that hasn't worked anymore for us. We need a new foreign policy. Since 1989, I don't know what America's foreign policy is. You have 1 minute to tell us, what is America's foreign policy? And if we don't have one, what should it be?
Okay, well, being on the Armed Services Committee for 4 years, I know that we have a foreign policy. And it has been to restore relationships across the world, to build better relationships with countries that surround hot spots, particular areas there. We've kept up a strong defense, and I think that's appropriate. But we've also put more into soft power, but we have not done enough. When I talk about soft power, I talk about making sure that we have a presence like other countries do. Foreign aid is under 1% of our budget. And it is better to be there and help with a school, send some textbooks, come in emergencies and that sort of thing, and develop a trust and a support. I remember a man from Pakistan told me on on the Armed Services Committee that he learned to love America because he went to the American Library and he read all about us and what we stood for. And he said, now we just are not there. And this was several years ago. And he said the newspaper article, the editorial recently was from Castro. He said, where is the United States? And we need to think and remember that.
Thank you. Follow up of a minute on this. If you understand what our foreign policy is, why do we bomb in Libya and not act militarily in Syria or Iran or Egypt or Bahrain right now where people are protesting? How do we pick and choose when we take military action? If we can't figure it out, how does the rest of the world understand how we're going to respond, and how can we use our influence on the world if they can't predict how we're going to act?
Well, you flatter me if you think I was inside the circle there at the White House. I was not, just for the record. And I have often said, why are we in, say, Saudi Arabia, where we know they don't have women's rights and we don't engage there, and yet in Afghanistan we do. So there is a pick and choose, and underlying all of this, yes, we have an American sense that we can fix things and that we should try to fix things everywhere, and that's not always, the best approach. And then there's also, we look to see who else is around there and what's in our best interest as well. How many enemies do we have in that region, for example? And what would a presence there do for us to strengthen our position? Like if we put aircraft carriers there, are we putting the aircraft carriers there just out of a sense of nobility, or are we protecting an oil supply? So it's not done, it appears illogical, and I'm not saying I support everything done all the time. I don't. But they do, and I think true every administration, Republican or Democrat, look at all of